Hello everybody, this is my new project on the entire history of the Zelda series. This will be a multiple part series on as many games that I can cover that use the Zelda brand. Main series, spin-offs and the most obscure, I'll cover it. This first part in particular covers the early days, from the mid-80s to 1991's A Link to the Past. I hope you enjoy. If you do, tell me and I'll see what I can do about it. Beginning with the beginning, the original Legend of Zelda was released in 1986 for the Famicom in Japan, and up to a year later in parts of America and Europe. And whilst it had a brilliant reception at the time, the game is not worth playing at all now. Now the NES only has two buttons to work off outside of movement, start and select, and one of those, the A button, is for just the sword. So the B button is used for every other item in the game, but the only items you really need out of the massive variety you have are bombs, potions and candles. This is where the repetitiveness of Zelda 1's combat comes in. Unless you are constantly at full health and have the sword beam equipped, you can only attack one space in front of where Link is facing. So when attacking, you always place yourself in danger of getting hit again, as the movement of the enemies isn't telegraphed in any way, and most times fly about at fucking random, so taking damage is a certainty in most scenarios. But the worst part about the original Zelda is how stupidly cryptic it is. Nothing in this game is given for free except your first sword. If you come to this game with zero prior knowledge, just finding the first dungeon could be a chore in itself. The map is so useless, they may as well replace the grey box with a swastika. Oh wait, they did in the dungeon, never mind. The world as a whole has a landmarks or key areas you would remember, so traversing hard like a game of hide and seek. Hello. Buying items and upgrades to your sword that you sometimes need to progress is stupidly expensive and requires extensive grinding and enemies that only sometimes drop rupees. Bosses are largely forgettable as well, including the final fight with Ganon, with most of it coming down to hitting the enemy first until its heart drops out and adding it to your own personal collection. But after you eventually beat Ganon by bombing an unmarked rock in a mountain somewhere, the day is saved, and a sequel would inevitably be made. And 1 year later, it was. Would it expand on the original's concepts and ideas and become a master of the 8-bit generation? Well, no. Zelda 2, The Adventure of Link, is most certainly the black sheep of the main series. Rather than being a true sequel, the top-down adventure of the first, Zelda 2 is a 2D side-scroller, and while the first game was certainly a challenge to complete through poor design and bad map layout, it is by no means impossible to beat. This game says screw that and use protection before you take your pride and fuck it into the ground. This game is hard. Very hard. The Adventure of Link is a little bit more helpful in telling you where you're supposed to go, but makes up for that by swinging a mace right into your genitals. Items are gone for the most part, and health is restored by entering Link's Shag Shack or by hoping an enemy drops a rare potion. When you die in this game, you respawn back at Zelda's temple, excluding the final dungeon, which makes saving up lives only useful at the very end of the game. Problem is, dying is so common in this game, trying to keep more than 5 of the little bastards before reaching this place is like finding snow in the Sahara. Enemies in this game have one of two strategies, either throwing a projectile or they are the projectile. In most areas this isn't too bad, just focus on an enemy and you're good to go. However, some enemies have both of these traits, like the axe throwing Dairas and the boomerang throwing Goyras. These guys will throw a weapon in an arc or a loop around Link, and dodging these attacks is harder than you think. The Dairas are the harder of the two, as reading the arc of the axe flying through the air is always changing as they march forwards. And the knockback from all attacks, not just these few, is big enough to put Castlevania to shame. Bosses are tougher than before, I'm glad to say, but that isn't always a good thing. These arseholes are just enemies that do double damage, take more hits to kill with a very specific hitbox. Dungeons are replaced with palaces now, which is just a bunch of rooms with enemies, keys and locked doors. But if there's one area that cements itself as being a defining piece of the game, and shows my issues with it, has to be the infamous Death Mountain. It's important to note, Death Mountain isn't even a part itself, just a means to an end. The only reason you're here is for a hammer which you use to break a few boulders. Death Mountain is such a badly designed area, with tons of dead ends and different routes leading to nothing, an ocean of enemies and axes to avoid, lava pits of instant death, and massive knockback from the enemies to make it a certainty you die, or feels extra rewarding if you can't have it with just a mallet. It may sound like I'm whining about a single area in the game, but everything I just mentioned repeats itself across the entire game, is only to a much lesser extent than Fatality Falls' Labyrinth. And that is serious mood whiplash when Death Mountain is located directly after the first palace. But to end on a high note, we did get some serious tables from this game, such as Dark Link, magic spells, the revival of Ganon, towns and NPCs, reoccurring enemies like Iron Knuckles and Dark Nuts, a third piece of the Triforce. Yeah, believe it or not, the first game was the Triforce of Power and Wisdom. Don't let tactically confuse you. Zelda 2 was a good experiment that died out after the first test subject, for now anyway, and despite its hardships, I enjoyed the game in a love-hate sort of way. It is certainly an improvement over the first game in my eyes, but neither really cement themselves as games that define the series. Anyway, with God Age of Gaming coming to a close, the third game had a job to do. Which of its predecessors would it learn from, and would it be the right choice? It most certainly was. Into the age of SNES, A Link to the Past is honestly one of their best games released for Super Nintendo, and the game that really launched the Zelda series into what it is today. Going back to the top-down style of original Legend of Zelda, ALTTP expands so much farther that makes up them completely changing genres for a single game. This game is much more refined and enjoyable from the first, removing the obtusely confusing mess of a map and giving the player not only world of Hyrule to fully explore, but also the Dark World below. Let's start with the story. I didn't mention it for Zelda 1 and 2 because it boils down to a splash screen where you either kill Ganon and rescue Zelda, or stop Ganon and rescue Zelda. It didn't seem worth mentioning. Also, with this game being said to take place years before the events of the first two, there is no need to worry about being confused and missing any important details. The game begins by having a vision of Zelda, taken by the wizard Aghanim, kidnapping all 7 sages that are said to guard the Sacred Realm, with Zelda herself being trapped within the dungeon of Hyrule Castle. Your uncle declares to you that you should stay behind as he sets out to free Zelda. That doesn't really work though, as you find him collapsed on the floor 2 feet inside a well. So you take a sword and shield, work your way through the dungeon, open the door to Zelda's cell, pick up a lantern and boomerang on the way. Zelda tells you to head to the throne room and escape via the sewers to the sanctuary, and upon your arrival, Priest informs you that should Aghanim get into the Dark World and claim a Triforce, evil will be unleashed upon Hyrule. The only way to defeat Aghanim will be to get the Master Sword and enter the Sacred Realm for yourself. So with that advice from the priest, after a gift from Zelda, Link begins his quest. 3 dungeons later, you can prize the sword from its pedestal and return to the sanctuary, only to find that Aghanim has broken his way in, took Zelda, you at Hyrule Castle in order to beat him, but before you can, he sends Link into the land mirroring Hyrule, the Dark World. Here Link sets about to free the 7 sages and use their power to get into the Tower of Hera, Aghanim's fortress. Battling to the top and clashing with Link one more time, About arises from Aghanim's corpse and breaks its way into the pyramid where the Triforce is resting. This part is actually Ganon, and Link must fight the King of Darkness once more and strike head to head for the fate of both worlds. When you finally beat Ganon, the day is saved, the light and dark worlds return to what they were, and this Link's adventure is over. As far as stories go, this one isn't very meaty. Yeah, there's a structure, nice flow to it, and everything happens for a reason, but I think future games really try and flesh out more of the world than in this one. Most NPCs have only one line of dialogue, and that's usually filler. Some do give you items like bug catching net, free bottles and flippers to swim in deep water, but that's only very rarely. But enough about the story. This is a game you're playing, and it's a pretty damn good one. For the most part, this game handles the same as the first, only expands and inflates upon it to the point of bursting. The B button this time uses for the sword rather than the A button, which is reserved for interacting with people and objects, as well as dashing when you get the Pegasus boots. Your items are assigned to the Y button, and X brings up the map, which is a staggering improvement over the first game, because it actually has detail and landmarks. I can actually remember certain locations in this game, like Kakuka Village, Lake Hylia, the Swamp, Lost Woods, Death Mountain, Hyrule Castle. This world of Hyrule is so much easier to digest and take in than the first game, and you aren't looking around blindly trying to find your next objective, because the map pinpoints your next location. One thing I will say, however, is that until you get about halfway into the game, it is rather linear in your approach, as you must do certain dungeons in a certain order, until you get to the Dark World. And yes, dungeons do make a return, rather than taking Zelda 2's palaces. I'm glad to say, these are so much better. First thing is that all dungeons follow a certain order. Find the compass, map and boss key before acquiring the item and using that to clear the dungeon, and finally defeating the boss and claiming your heart container. Dungeons are more puzzle focused this time, and while there's still a bunch of rooms that require just killing all enemies to progress, but the methods are encouraged in this game rather than just combat. Not saying combat is a bad thing, just when Link is surrounded by enemies, it's quite easy to get hit many times when you don't really need to, as the invulnerability frames last about less than a second. Bosses, as well, act more like puzzles than the first, making the player think about its weaknesses and where to hit rather than just spamming the sword. And the final boss especially does make it easy for you, with attacks moving large arcs and fire whips that fling towards you, which makes it my favourite boss in the game. However, you still need the silver arrows in order to beat him, so if you made it this far and didn't bother to upgrade the bow at any point, then you wasted your goddamn time. As for the rest of the items, I only really use them when I need them. All items work off a magic meter now, and when you run out, you can no longer use items, save for the bombs, boomerang and bow. Yeah, the medallions are good screen nukes, and the fire and ice rods work well on certain enemies, but they respawn as soon as I re-enter the screen, so I'd rather just run by them all, or kill them with my sword, which is more reliable, and doesn't eat up my magic meter. What the items are good for outside dungeons is finding hidden secrets and heart pieces. Heart pieces are mini segments of heart containers. Collect 4 of them and you get a new heart container, and you can have up to 20 of them by the time you face a Garden. As for other secrets, they tend to be fairy fountains that can upgrade weapons, and kept in a bottle can revive Link when he dies, or rooms full of rupees and resources, which are good for buying potions. This game encourages exploration and looking under every crevice to get an advantage. For example, if you have the item from the 6th dungeon, you can completely skip 2 rooms in the 5th dungeon. However, it isn't all good. In stark contrast to Zelda 2, and even the original, this game is stupidly easy. Not many areas should give you a massive challenge, except maybe the final dungeon. In fact, most of your deaths in this game come from overconfidence rather than difficulty. At the end of the game, you're given a tally of how many times you've died and in what dungeon. And surprisingly, most of mine were in the early dungeons at the beginning of the game, rather than later on. Except for Skull Woods. Fuck that place. I can only assume this is because of the game's design. Because you can do the Dark World dungeons in any order, they kept difficulty fairly consistent across all of them, and that only worked to the game's detriment. Fast travel is also very annoying to use here. You have to get this flute from the forest and play it at the weather vane in the light world, but it takes a good few seconds for the bird to appear, and if you get hit during the animation, it can knock you out of the fast travel. And even still, the bird only goes to 8 locations across all of Hyrule, and none in the Dark World. But overall, A Link to the Past was a brilliant introduction to 90s for Nintendo's best franchise. The story is good, the gameplay is the best it's been so far, and the music isn't bad either, with some adaptations of Zelda 1's themes becoming some of my favourites. And before I move on and see what's next for the series, I shall quickly list off all ports and remakes these 3 games have all had. Zelda 1 and 2 were both included on the Zelda Collector's Edition in 2003 for the GameCube, with updated game scripts and reduced screen flickering, which is the version future ports would use, rather than the originals on the NES. This includes the 2004 NES Classic line for the GBA, and the Virtual Console releases on the Wii and Wii U. Both games did make it onto 3DS Virtual Console, but used the NES scripts rather than the recent ones, which is confusing. Zelda 1 was included as a time-limited masterpiece on Smash Bros. Brawl and Smash for Wii U, with both games make it onto NES Classic console in 2016. A Link to the Past did see a GBA port, where it was also bundled in with 4 Swords, a game I shall cover later, as well as a Virtual Console release on Wii, 3DS and Wii U, before being featured on the Super Nintendo Classic console in 2017. Finally, all 3 games are free to play with Switch's online service, which is how I recorded footage for this video. And Zelda 1 and 2 also got remixed versions to give the player certain buffs and advantages. After Link to the Past, the Zelda series entered a sort of limbo, but not much of note really happened. It took an entire 7 years for its next home console release, and only one handheld game to fill in the gap of official content during that time. So next time I'll be covering the quiet years of the Zelda series, starting with Link's Awakening on the Game Boy, and ending with Life on the N64. Thanks for watching, and good night.